Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started on today's Tap-In live call. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to keep this one laser focused and talk about the fourth law out of the 8 laws that we talked about at the super meeting. What I've done in this series is take the 8 laws for double-digit profit that we rolled out at the super meeting in San Diego, which were work the model, win the day, communicate in rhythm. Fantastic laws to run your business with. And so I've taken these and applied these to how do these help us as service managers? And I know we have different roles, different positions on this call, from owners to technicians, service managers. When I present these tap-in calls, I always look at this through the eyes of the service manager, or how do we interact with our technicians? Okay, so that'll be the view that we approach this on. So today we're going to talk about law number 4, achieve the call goal. And a lot of achieving the call goal falls on the CSRs. So what is the role of the CSR? We're going to talk about that, the CSR manager, the service manager role, and also at the end of this call, we'll also get into a few things that are important this year going into our, especially for the HVAC companies, going into the summertime, and how can we maximize some of those opportunities? Okay, so this original presentation, if you want to view as it was delivered at the super meeting in San Diego, on the Nexstar website, go to Meetings and Events, select Go to Super Meeting, and you'll see a fantastic presentation, the actual presentation that Dave Bodek did at the super meeting, and it was a fantastic job, geared more towards service, customer service and customer service management. So we're going to take that, morph it a little bit as to what does that mean for us wearing the service manager hat. Okay. All of the attendees are muted, but if you have a question throughout this, please, you have the ability to raise your hand. I can unmute you. I really encourage you to make this an interactive session, so don't hesitate to make this interactive, raise questions. We've got a relatively small group today, so so don't feel like you're wasting any time by raising a question. There are no bad questions. I encourage questions throughout this. All right. So what is the role of the CSR? Okay, well, scheduling, picking and choosing calls. These are often things that CSRs find on their plate, but it doesn't necessarily mean that these are the best use of your time. And so I would encourage you to look at your customer service reps and ask yourself, are we distracting them from doing their primary function, which is the final one, turning callers into booked calls? Okay, we often put filing duties, putting together packets, sometimes helping with accounting. And I'm a realist. I get those things all happen within a business. We have to take advantage of the manpower. But the primary role of that CSR is turning callers into booked calls. That's the primary thing that should not be lost. The key metric for a customer service rep is call conversion. How many calls did we have come in, and how many of those did we book? All right. Book the call is the most important metric for the customer service rep. So book the call, book the call, book the call. The CSR manager's role is scheduling. There are a lot of things that fall on that plate as well. And I realize in many of our businesses, you may not have a dedicated CSR manager, but somebody within the business is wearing that hat, or at least wearing a portion of that hat. Is that fair to say? So as we go through this, keep in mind, you might not have the dedicated people, and I know people often, you might have a CSR/dispatcher. Sure, that's great. But when we talk about these roles, think of what percentage of that person's time is devoted to this role. Okay, so the primary role of the CSR manager is to maximize the number of calls booked. The third option, maximizing the number of calls booked. Okay, so a key metric for a CSR manager is, did we achieve our minimum call count today? Okay, did we achieve the minimum call count today? And I would encourage you to look at your business like a mathematical formula. We know what our average ticket is. We know what our technician conversion rates are. But if we don't have the calls, the rest of that math doesn't quite work out, right? So being at the call count is a real critical factor here. How many calls is enough? And so the natural tendency is, okay, we've achieved that minimum call count, so let's back off, take your foot off the gas a little bit, and that's the wrong answer. So we want to make sure that we've got enough great opportunities coming in so that we can really maximize these opportunities. And a good way to think about this is poker. If we're playing poker, you don't the more cards that you get in your hand, the better chances you are of having a winning hand. And the same is with the calls that we take on. The more calls that come into that call center, the more calls that get booked, the better your opportunities become because you have choices at that point. Thinking HVAC, are we going to run a 5-year-old tune-up or are we going to run a 15-year-old no cool? Which one of those is the opportunity that you want your team on? So keep booking the calls, and as a service manager, you want to have that communication with your call takers, anyone that's answering that phone. CSR goals are minimum goals. Okay, so if you have 3-day call boards, which I highly encourage within your customer service departments, those are minimum goals. Okay, and we don't want to book 3 calls per guy and then shut it down, or keep those coming. Keep those coming. We need this to be fluid, not set in stone and then let's think about tomorrow. Always keep looking at how can we maximize this. And the CSR manager's role is to maximize the number of calls being booked. Okay, how many calls came in? How many of those do we book? So don't get hung up on the minimum call count. Not every call needs to happen today, and this is a really critical piece. And I'm not going to go real deep into the mechanics of, how do we reschedule a customer? How do we not book time slots? Those types of things, which we teach in the call center schools. Really, Dave Boda, Tom Marriott do a fantastic job of teaching some of those things. But I'm not going to get too hung up on those things. Okay, so what we're going to focus on today is a lot of things that come in don't have to be booked today. So how can we prioritize those? All right. We can communicate with the customer. Ask them, when would you like this? We don't have them sitting at home. Again, we teach in the call center school to communicate with the customer through phone calls, through text, where we don't have to promise a window and they don't have to sit at home and wait for us all day. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the service manager's role. All right. What is our role in achieving our call count? Number one, communicate with the CSR and the CSR manager. And we need to really look at this. We're the team that has to look in our technician's eyes and say, I'm sorry, I don't have enough calls for you today. I'm just going to go ahead and send you home. And that's not the right answer. Even though our primary role is not to take that phone call or to book the call, or typically it's not, but we still own that, okay? That's still our process that we own. So communicate with the CSR manager, and make sure that you're working as a team to do everything that we can possibly do to get these calls. They need to understand what your manpower is, what your expectations are, what type of calls we need. Communicate with that CSR. The daily huddle is a great vehicle for this. We talked about the daily huddle on the last call, which was communicating in rhythm. And the daily huddle is a very important piece to this, because whoever's wearing that customer service manager's hat and you need to be on the same page as to how many calls do we have, what do we need, where are we at on this, okay? What can I do to help you? So working as a team, not against each other, not finger pointing, but working as a team to really, how can we find these calls? And this might start with a morning huddle, but I would encourage you not to end there, because you might actually find, for example, I had a morning huddle with my dispatcher. I had an 11 o'clock huddle and a 3 o'clock huddle, because I want to know throughout the day, where are we at on today's calls? Where are we at with our opportunities? How are we looking for tomorrow? Are we at call count for tomorrow yet? What are we going to do to get there? So communicating throughout the day is the best practice. You can get a lot of great information there and work with your team. Okay. All right. So let's daily huddle, critical throughout the day. Identify the right calls. And what I mean by the right call is, what is the right call, right type of call? So looking at a 3-day call board, and let's say that we're at our minimum call count, but are those really the calls that you want? Okay, and so what I mean by that is, if we've, think air conditioning for a moment, if we've got a board set up and most of the calls on our board today are going to be 5-year or newer maintenances that on equipment that we put in, is that really the best day for you? Probably not. Okay, so the right call would be what? Opportunity calls, equipment over 10 years old, mainline stoppages, water heaters over 10 years old. What are the right calls for us to get the most effect that we can possibly get, and how can we get those calls? And there are a number of things we can do to drive those things. We might mine those from our customers, from our maintenance base. Asking the age of equipment. Typically, there are 3 calls that we can ask when the call is booked. Do you know the age of your equipment? Do you know the age of your furnace? Do you know the age of your air conditioner? If they don't, what year was your home built? And the third question, how long have you lived here? Typically, by asking one of those 3 questions, you can narrow this down and get a pretty good idea of what the age of equipment is. In a plumbing scenario, you might take a call for disposal, disposal not working, leaky faucet not working. Asking how old your water heater is or how old the home is still absolutely relevant, because we expect our technicians to go in that home and do a thorough evaluation of the home. And should they notice anything that deserves the customer's attention, what would you like me to do? Well, if they're in a home that's got a 12-year-old water heater, that's absolutely going to be an opportunity that we're going to try to set ourselves up with in the dispatch department. Okay, so what are the right types of calls? In my business, I knew that if I had, I would book the calls that we had for the day, but I knew that I needed 22 old calls. When I say old, I identified those as 11 years or older. But if I started the day with 11 old calls, I knew that we would create interest in 50% of those, turn those over to a comfort advisor or a selling tech, and out of those, 65 to 70% would close. At the end of the day, that would net out to 6 or 7 installs. It was like a mathematical formula. But if we didn't have the old calls to start, you're not going anywhere. You're setting yourself up for failure from the very beginning part of your day. So identify the right calls, and I call it 3-dimensional dispatching, but it's not enough just to have the calls, but you need to have the right calls. Next, we're going to talk about outbound calling. Outbound calling is probably the most effective way to get calls on the board and get immediate results today. Now, a couple of keys for outbounding, and again, as a service manager, this is not the time for you to stand there and watch and say, okay, well, what are we going to do? It's, how can I help you? Are we outbounding? What calls, who are we calling? Have we looked at this month's maintenances? Do we have customers that we can call? Do you need me to help? Who's doing the outbound calling? And again, this is some people are better at outbound calling than others. It's just the reality of it. Some people actually kind of like it. Some people actually just despise it, and the person that really doesn't enjoy doing that is probably not going to be very successful at it. So identifying who are the superstars at outbounding. Do we have a script for them to follow? Do they have an enticing offer? Do we have a way to create urgency? Okay, and some of the offers that you can use would be water heater flush, air conditioning system check, heating system check, thorough home evaluation. There are a lot of different compelling offers, but if you script it have a couple of different offerings, and then put the right person on the other end of the phone. It's probably the single biggest thing you can do to put calls on the board today. And I know from the coaching calls that I have, this is a real sensitive issue, because for many companies in different parts of the country, we're still kind of in that slow time, okay, especially for the air conditioning companies. Summer hasn't hit yet. So, we're running some maintenances, maybe not maximizing those opportunities as well as we could. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But getting the calls on the board, that's the critical factor. Because right now, manpower is a common shortage throughout the country. We need to keep our technicians occupied, busy, and on great calls. That's our goal. So the best way to do it, outbound calling. All right. And I'll pause there for a moment. What questions do we have? If you would like to ask a question at this point, please don't hesitate. On your control panel, you can raise your hand. I can unmute you, and you're among friends here. Okay, we'll move on. Okay, stop me anytime. We've got a relatively small group today, which is nice, so don't hesitate. Okay, perfect. What can we do? Clover leafing, 223s, as I call them. A non-negotiable standard in my company was that we would clover leaf, in other words, door hangers or leaflets. The ones I personally had in my company were almost like a big stick-em pad, almost like a Post-it note. And, they had our offer on, a tune-up offer, and, we would stick that to the door frames or the storm doors or the windows for the houses, 2 houses to the left, 2 houses to the right, and 3 houses across the street. All right. Clover leafing is basic guerrilla marketing, and it's a great way to put calls on the board. When I was very slow, I would have my technicians ask my technicians to go up and down the whole block. If we're not very busy, let's go to the whole block. Clover leaf everybody. If I'm really slow, I would have them knock on the doors and hand them to the customer and ask them if they needed a tune-up. It's amazing what you can drive when you just ask for it. So again, basic guerrilla marketing, but a great way to drive some calls. SPPs. I know I've talked to many of you about this quite a bit, but this is probably one of my biggest hot buttons is having maintenance customers. And the key to growing the maintenance customers is we don't wait till we're slow to talk about it. We talk about it when we're busy. We talk about it when we're slow. We talk about it all the time. We coach to it. We measure it. We set expectations within our business. But selling clubs, SPPs, whatever you call them within your business, is a critical activity for success. Because the more clubs you have, the less seasonality less pain of seasonality that you're going to have on your plate. And, and it's interesting that within my business before coming to Nexstar, I realized how stable the platform we were. Our maintenance 1 technicians ran 4 calls per day. That didn't change from February, March, July, or August. It was 4 calls per day. It didn't change. My maintenance 2 techs ran 3 calls per day. It didn't change in February, March, or July. It was always the same. My senior technicians ran 2 calls per day, period. That didn't change from February to July, peak season. We didn't change the model of the business. And the reason that we were able to keep that platform so consistently stable was our number 1 driver in the business was to get our customers involved in the club and make them a customer for life. So this is a critical activity that takes the pain of the seasonality, especially for heating and air conditioning. But for plumbing businesses, for electrical business, equally critical and is a key to the growth of your company. Okay, so a moment ago we talked about how important it is to have those opportunity calls. Well, if you've got thousands of SPP customers that you can call upon, you know what the age of the equipment is, that's where you find those remaining 5 calls or those remaining 10 old calls or opportunity calls that you need mine those from your SPPs. Okay. Following up on estimates, following up on recommendations. You know, this has changed a little bit because a lot of companies are on tablets, paperless, but the lost art of following up on the recommendations, you know, has changed a little bit, but it hasn't made it any less important. All right. So if we had technicians out there, you know, 2 weeks ago, 30 days ago, maybe even up to 6 months ago, going back through those recommendations and mining those has always been a best practice. And so what that looks like within your business, if you're electronic, it might, you know, be something that you have to work out. But in the old days, um, our invoices were, our office copies of our invoices were green, and we called them farming in the greens, you know, because we could pull out a manila folder of green invoices and just start going through them. Hey, we recommended a water heater out here. I'm going to give them a call. It, it's an old but a best practice. But if you don't have the work, if you don't have the calls, follow up on estimates. Okay, there's a lot of work hanging out there that maybe the time wasn't right for the customer to pull the trigger on that, but maybe now it is, especially if we can build a compelling enough case to take care of this now before we get into the season. You know, we've got time to do this, and what you do with the pricing on that might even be another component of that. But there's a lot of opportunities out there on the recommendations we've made. A lot of those recommendations might live on the summary of findings. So again, if we've got paper summary of findings that are turned in with invoices, filed away, you know, that's a gold mine. If it's electronic version and those things are captured electronically, but they're in the system, then we're going to have to take a little bit different process to mine those. But going through the summary of findings, again, fantastic high return activities, because we've been there, we've done our job, we've given some choices, we put together some options based on the observations that we had. So within those summary of findings, there could be some great opportunities. So that's a fantastic place to start. If you don't have the activities that you need today, follow up on your estimates, look at your summary of findings. So I want to stimulate some critical thinking here for a moment. Is one call per day enough? Okay, it might be. It might be. If it's the right call, it really could be. And I would encourage you to look at the bandwidth that you have within your team and how many calls do we really need? And some people have a number in their head, and if, okay, well, I've got four calls from my top guy, I'm going to give him 4 calls today, and I'm going to send this other guy home because he's not doing very well. Well, if you get the top guy on 1 call per day, it might be enough. Okay, that would be a perfect scenario if we had 1 great call per day per tech. So what are we doing on this call? Are we really maximizing our opportunities? And this time of the year, especially on the HVAC, and often in the plumbing, I guess, really is the natural tendency is to run through some of these calls and kind of check the box. Okay, I ran 4 tune-ups today. I ran 4 SPPs today. I did my job. But that's not really true. What are we doing on this call? And that's where, as service managers, we need to slow our team down. We need to maybe micromanage them a little bit. I know that sounds terrible, but what I'm saying by that is getting interactive with them on the call. You know, if our call volume is light today, then let's reach out to our techs. Let's communicate with them. All right, what have you got out there? What's the age of that water heater? Okay, what are you thinking for your offerings? Really driving that equation and working in tandem with your service technician to help him craft the most effective summary of findings while you're with him on the other end of that phone. Okay, so walking them through, helping them craft it, stimulating some thought. Have you looked at this? What's the coil look like? How's the blower? Have you pulled the blower? Did you show it to the customer? Did you wipe out the inside of the return? Really critical thinking and helping your technicians see opportunities that they might not be slowing down enough to look at. Ductwork, for example, especially in southern climates where ductwork, duct cleaning, duct replacement, you know, is a strong activity for you. This is the time to slow those technicians down and follow the process. Follow the process. Okay. And finally, right tech to the right call. You know, I have conversations quite often where we, you know, our technician is complaining because he's not getting, you know, he's running a steady diet of 5-year-old maintenances. And so my next question is that your top turning technician? Well, yeah. Okay, well, should he ever be on a 5-year or newer piece of equipment? Probably not. You know, just get the right tech to the right call. If your green technician or the technician that's not performing at you know, shop average, you know, he may be the one to get the 5-year newer piece of equipment. But if your top lead setting technician is on a 5-year-old piece of equipment, you know, we've shot ourselves in the foot. So really looking at, and again, this goes back to those huddles with the dispatcher, you know, communicating in the morning at 11, at 3, you know, who's going to this call? Who's going to this call? What happened on that call? You know, and really driving the results of getting the right tech to the right call. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment. Do we have any questions at this point? Okay, no questions so far. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about Spring Jumpstart. This is primarily HVAC geared, but I would invite you to open your mind and think of this from a plumbing standpoint too, because it never hurts to do a jumpstart and with your teams, because we kind of get into routines. You know, our technicians definitely get into routines, and I'm talking to a lot of companies right now that are going into springtime. Okay, we're going into that busy season. We're trying to gear up. In many areas, our technicians are already starting to run spring SPPs or spring maintenances or system checks, whichever your process is. So the first question I ask is, have we done a kickoff? And typically I get a no. So let's think about this. And again, this applies to plumbing, it applies to electrical, but doing a spring refresher means going back to the basics of, you know, keep in mind, one of the things I've always loved about heating and air conditioning as a technician was that I didn't feel like it was boring to me, because it was almost like having two different careers. We're in heating mode for half the year, then we shift gears and we get back into HVAC, which is completely different. You know, it's charging units, checking airflow. You know, we're working on condensers instead of furnaces primarily, and it's a completely different animal. So mentally, we need to reset that. We need to go back to the checklist. And this, again, if it's a plumbing checklist, this is probably a good time to go back at least twice a year, do a reset, go back to the basics of, let's go through our checklist together. When we say check the water pressure, what are we talking about? When we say check the gas pressure on this gas valve, what are we talking about? How do we do that? What tools do you have? What tools do you need? So go back through your spring checklist and make sure that our team is mentally prepared, physically prepared, technically prepared to execute that checklist. They understand it. They have the tools required to do those steps, and they understand how to communicate those steps to the customer. Okay. One of the things I call a top 10 refresher, and this is a fantastic interactive activity that you can do with your teams to stimulate some critical thinking. But what I mean by this, if I'm going into a spring check, what are the top 10 opportunities that I would expect to notice on that call? And if you have an interactive session with your technicians, they're going to come up with things like, well, you know, capacitors, contactors, refrigerant, UV light maybe, filters, cleaning the coil. You know, there are going to be a top 10 list of things that you're going to see pretty consistently on most spring checks. Okay, same thing applies on plumbing. If we're doing a system evaluation on a plumbing call, or maybe it's just an SPP call for plumbing, what are the top 10 things we really need to drill into? Are we taking the lid off the toilet tanks? Are we putting dye in? Are we checking the pressure at the hose bib outside to see what the house pressure is? You know, are we inspecting the washing machine hoses? Are we looking at all the emergency shutoffs underneath the sinks? So these are the types of things that we should be looking for. But again, we've got to bring our teams back to the basics and help them understand what are we looking for. And then after we're on the same page of what are some of these top 10 items, okay, the next step is how do we explain those to the customer? Features, function, and benefit. Feature, function, benefit. So if I notice that the washing machine hoses are, you know, probably 15 years old, how do I explain that to a customer in a way that they understand, hey, this is kind of a serious thing. This is one of the number one causes of water damage within homes. And, because they're behind the washing machine, a lot of times they're kind of out of sight and out of mind. And I replace a lot of these. Matter of fact, I've got some on the truck right now. I'm going to go ahead and make a note of that for you. Okay. How do we explain this to a customer where in a way that they say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's go ahead and take care of that today. Right. On the air conditioning calls, it could be capacitors. Capacitors aren't as robust as they used to be. We tend to replace those like candy now. So that should be an item where we can explain what does a capacitor do in a way that the customer understands it. Okay. It's, because it's real easy to lose our customers when we get caught up in technical jargon. So we need to help our technicians find the customer-friendly words to explain these things. Okay. Inventory assessment. When we look at this change in the season and we do this reset, and again, I'm talking primarily HVAC, but it doesn't matter because we need to go back to basics even on plumbing and electrical, but we need to reassess our inventory. So if we're out there, do we have the refrigerants on the truck? Do we have coil cleaner? Do we have UV lights? We're going to talk about these top 10 things, but if we get the guys all excited, we teach them how to go out there and sell it, but then they don't have any of these things on their truck, nothing's going to happen. They're not going to move it. So getting the inventory aligned with our beliefs and our skills, inventory's got to support that. So take a look at that. Technical refreshers. Going back to the basics of, okay, it's a new system, so it's a new season. So if I'm a heating technician, I haven't charged a unit in 6 months. I've been working on heaters. My heating skills are kind of at the top of their game right now because I've had a steady diet of heaters for the last 6 months. But now we're shifting gears and we're going into air conditioning mode. So what do I need to dust off? Well, I need to make sure I remember how to do superheat, subcool, temperature differentials, how to charge a unit if it's, below optimum temperature. What are some of the things I can do to achieve that? What are the technical processes that we need to pull off the shelf and dust off so that our technicians are, set up for success again? Okay. And process refresher. What I mean by process refresher is, do our technicians know how to handle certain situations? Have we shared that with them, or have we even defined what that means? And so here's a great example. Refrigerant leaks. Springtime, we tend to run a lot of system checks. Maybe we notice systems are low on refrigerant. If it's one of ours that we've put in the last 5 years, a lot of times we dump refrigerant in and run, okay? But the bad news is that all comes back to haunt us in June and July, because if it's a leaker, it's going to leak out again. So if we have a clearly defined process, while we perform these spring checks, should we notice the system is low on refrigerant, what are we going to do? Okay, we're going to educate the customer about what this means. We're going to offer a leak check. Okay, if it's the first time we've ever been out there, we'll establish a baseline, but we have the customer initial the invoice that there is no warranty on refrigerant, and I'm just giving you examples of what your process might look like. But if we're going into a season where we haven't used those skills for a while, again, revisiting what our process is and what our expectations are in these types of calls can prevent an avalanche of warranties, a month or two from now. Okay. And finally, crisis mode identified. And what I mean by that is, the inverse of what we've been talking about. So we're talking a lot about what do we do if we don't have a lot of calls and how to maximize those. But we also need to look at what is the side effect of too many calls, okay? And if we're geared to run to take 100 calls a day and suddenly we get our first significant weather event of the year and we've got 300 calls coming in, who are we taking care of? You know, have we defined who that is? And again, we want to make sure that this is our season and we maximize our opportunities. So who are we going to take care of? Are we going to pull that into a hit zone? You know, have we identified zip codes that we're going to take care of? Are we going to take care of our maintenance customers first? Have we promised them that? You know, again, what is our crisis mode for when that happens? Who gets rescheduled? Who gets ran? How many calls? What are we going to do with those? So again, this is a great time of the year to go back to the basics and identify what do we do when that day happens. All right. So I've done all the talking. We must have some questions out there. So let's, if you would like me to unmute you, please, on your control panel, raise your hand, and I would be happy to unmute you, and we'll have a conversation. Cricket. Nothing. Okay. If you're unsure of the hand raising process, you can also send a message as well. Okay. We'll wait just a moment. Okay. No questions. All right. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Our next call will be on Friday, June 16th, will be the next Tap In Live call. And if you have any questions or things that you'd like to discuss a little bit deeper, feel free to pop me an email, JODIED, like Joe died, at nextstarnetwork.com. And I would be happy to address any questions you might have. Oh, I've got a question. Okay. Dun, dun, dun. Hold the phone. Trying to get to you, Sean. Hold. Okay, Sean, you're unmuted. What is your question?
Jody, you there?
There you go. Hey, Sean.
There he is. How are you, buddy? Hey, I was just typing in
Great.
saying thank you. Appreciate these webinars.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I couldn't find the question pane there all of a sudden. I don't know where I put it, but anyway, no, I appreciate that, Sean. All right. Anything else? Oh, there it is. Beautiful. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a fantastic weekend, and I look forward to talking to you in the future. Bye now.